Hey guys, tonight we're taking a deep dive into a true story about your government, the one with the eagle on the letterhead, and "In God We Trust" on the currency, secretly dosing its own citizens with hallucinogens in a program so classified that when the documents were finally made public, the actual director of the CIA had already shredded most of them, which tells you everything you need to know about how confident those gentlemen were in their legacy. Tonight's topic is MKUltra, the covert mind control program that sounds like something a conspiracy theorist invented while wearing a tinfoil hat, except that it was completely real, officially admitted to by the United States government, and involved things your 11th grade history teacher absolutely did not cover. We're talking about safe houses, psychedelics, unwitting subjects, a one-legged chemist who loved folk dancing and kept goats, and at least one man who almost certainly did not jump out of a window of his own free will. Get comfortable. This is going to be a lot. Before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe genuinely only if you enjoy this kind of thing. No obligation, no guilt trip. Tonight's comment prompt: what would the CIA have to dose you with to convince you to sit through a government committee meeting voluntarily? Drop your answer below. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and get comfortable. Tonight, in honor of the subject matter, you may want to double-check your bedtime tea, just to be safe. You probably can't be too careful. Let's pause for a moment. Have you ever wondered what exactly the CIA thought was going to happen when they gave LSD to a man who had no idea he was taking it, and then kept dosing him for 77 consecutive days? Whether the government's official mind control program director actually had a goat farm, made his own yogurt, built his own furniture, and spent his weekends Morris dancing in the Virginia countryside? Because the answer is yes on every single count, and somehow that makes it worse? How a Cold War intelligence agency ended up running a series of apartments in San Francisco and New York that were stocked with two-way mirrors, hired women, and enough controlled substances to supply a very long weekend? What happens when a government decides that informed consent is, technically speaking, an operational inconvenience? How many universities quietly accepted CIA funding for human experimentation, asked absolutely no questions, and whether any of them are institutions you or someone you know attended? What it actually feels like to wake up in a psychiatric hospital with no memory of the previous several weeks, having been told you were receiving treatment, and slowly begin to understand that the treatment you received was someone's experiment? And whether the man most responsible for all of it, the limping chemist who architected the whole program, signed the authorizations, and spent years ensuring the documents were destroyed, ultimately faced any meaningful legal consequence for any of it? Spoiler: he retired peacefully to a goat farm in Virginia and eventually wrote a memoir. But we'll get there. Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1953 in a government office building in Washington, D.C. The air smells like cigarette smoke, cold coffee, and the particular anxious bureaucrat smell of manila folders that have been in a filing cabinet for slightly too long. Somewhere above your head, a fluorescent light is flickering its opinion about the whole situation. Outside the window, Senator McCarthy is on the radio. The Soviets have just tested a hydrogen bomb. The Korean War has just ended, sort of. And somewhere down the hall, a man with a slight limp and extraordinary institutional access is signing a document that will authorize one of the strangest programs in American history. You are, somehow, about to be involved. Try not to drink anything you weren't offered in a sealed container. Let's set the scene. It is 1953, and America is afraid. Not afraid the way you might be afraid of something reasonable, like a large spider or a dental appointment, afraid in that deep, systemic, civilizational way that makes governments do things that look, in hindsight, absolutely unhinged. The Soviet Union has the bomb. China has fallen. Korea has been fought to an ugly, inconclusive halt. And the men in suits at Langley, Virginia, the ones running the Central Intelligence Agency, in a building that is essentially a very well-funded bunker with a seal on the floor, have convinced themselves of something that will shape the next 2 decades of American covert history. They have convinced themselves that the Soviets have cracked the code. You are standing, metaphorically speaking, in one of those Langley offices. The desk is government issue. The chair is uncomfortable in the specific way that government chairs have always been uncomfortable, as though they were designed by someone who had read about sitting but had never actually tried it. The coffee is stale. There is a framed photograph of Eisenhower on the wall. There is also, on the desk, a report. The report concerns something the CIA's intelligence analysts have taken to calling brainwashing. This term has been floating around since the Korean War, when American POWs returned home, and some of them gave press conferences that seemed to put it diplomatically not entirely their own idea. Some of them praised the North Korean government. Some of them made statements that were, by any American standard, embarrassing. Some of them seemed not quite like the people who had left. And the CIA's working theory was not, perhaps, extended captivity and systematic psychological abuse produces behavioral changes. The CIA's working theory was, the Soviets have a drug, or a technique, or a machine, something that can reach inside a man's head and rearrange the furniture. And if they have it, the thinking went, we need to have it first. This is the founding logic of MKUltra, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the more remarkable pieces of institutional reasoning in American history. The Soviet threat was, at least partly, based on a misunderstanding of what had happened to American prisoners of war. The CIA would spend millions of dollars over the next 2 decades attempting to replicate and weaponize a capability the Soviets may not have actually possessed in the first place. It is, in a manner of speaking, like breaking into a neighbor's house because you're convinced they have a jetpack, and then spending 15 years in their basement trying to build one. The year is 1953. The CIA director is Allen Dulles, a silver-haired man in an expensive suit who looks exactly like what he was, a patrician, a lawyer, and a spy's spy. The kind of man who regarded secrecy as a natural state and oversight as a quaint suggestion. He has just authorized a new program. It has been assigned an arbitrary alphanumeric code, as all these programs are, and that code is MK for the agency's technical services staff, followed by ULTRA, apparently because the men naming these things wanted the word ultra in there, and no one said no. The program's formal name is Project MKUltra. Its informal mission is to find a way to control the human mind. And down the hall, in a smaller office with a slightly better view of the parking lot, a man named Sidney Gottlieb is rolling up his sleeves. Welcome to the beginning. It's going to be a very strange night. Let's start with what came before, because MKUltra did not arrive fully formed. It had a parent program, and the parent program had a parent program. And the lineage is worth tracing, because it tells you that the thinking behind all of this did not begin with Sidney Gottlieb and did not begin in 1953. It began with a war crime. And the people who inherited it knew exactly where it came from and decided that was fine. You are in a post-war interrogation room in 1945, and the men sitting across from German scientists are not trying to prosecute them. They are trying to recruit them. Operation Paperclip, which is a name that sounds considerably less sinister than it was the American program that extracted Nazi scientists from Germany after World War II and brought them to the United States to work for American institutions. The scientists included aerospace engineers who went to work on what eventually became NASA, and they included researchers from the medical experiments conducted in the concentration camps, whose work on human tolerance of extreme conditions, cold, pressure, chemicals, pain was considered operationally valuable by the American military and intelligence establishments, regardless of how it had been generated. The Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946 and 1947 had made very clear what the world thought of human experimentation conducted without consent. It had produced the Nuremberg Code. It had produced criminal convictions. Several of the Nazi doctors were hanged, and it had also, somewhere in the corridors of the American intelligence apparatus, produced a different kind of note, that the research existed, that it was extensive, and that someone should probably read it carefully before deciding what to do with it. Before MKUltra, there was Artichoke. Before Artichoke, there was Bluebird. Project Bluebird began in 1950, and its mandate was essentially what MKUltras would later refine: the exploitation of human subjects, using drugs and other methods to achieve behavioral control for intelligence purposes. Bluebird became Artichoke in 1951. Artichoke became MKUltra in 1953. The program did not change. The letterhead changed. Artichoke is worth pausing on because it is where the ethical architecture of the later program was essentially established. Artichoke operated under the direction of the CIA's Office of Security, and it conducted experiments that included combinations of drugs, hypnosis, and what the documents described as electroconvulsive therapy in field settings, meaning not in a hospital, not in a laboratory, but in safe house conditions on subjects who were, in many documented cases, foreign nationals being held for interrogation. You are watching an Artichoke session in 1952, in a room that is not a hospital and not a laboratory, but which has been set up to look something like both. The subject is a man whose nationality and full identity remain classified. He has been given a combination of drugs and subjected to hypnotic suggestion and has been asked questions, and the people asking the questions are recording his answers and his physiological responses with meticulous attention to detail. The official purpose of this exercise is to determine whether a subject can be made to reveal information that his conscious mind is trying to protect. The results were characteristically inconclusive. The drugs produced confusion. The hypnosis produced suggestibility of a limited and unreliable kind, and the combination produced a person who was sufficiently disoriented that you couldn't be sure whether the information he was giving you was true, confabulated, or simply a reflection of what he thought you wanted to hear, which is, from an intelligence standpoint, not tremendously useful. None of this stopped the program from expanding. It simply moved on. Artichoke became MKUltra and got a larger budget and a wider mandate, and Sidney Gottlieb's particular organizational intelligence applied to it, and the fundamental problem that you cannot reliably control what a human mind does under extreme duress was, apparently, considered not yet definitively proven. And so they kept going. because in institutions, especially secret ones, the hardest thing to do is stop. Let's talk about Sidney Gottlieb, because you cannot understand MKUltra without understanding Sidney Gottlieb. And Sidney Gottlieb is one of the most genuinely strange figures in 20th century American history, which is a competitive category. He was born in the Bronx in 1918, the son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants, and he stuttered. He had a clubfoot. He was, by most accounts, a deeply earnest, deeply intelligent man who wanted, genuinely and without irony, to serve his country. He earned a PhD in biochemistry from the California Institute of Technology. He grew his own food. He went Morris dancing on weekends. Morris dancing, in case you are unfamiliar, is the very English folk tradition of waving handkerchiefs and hitting sticks together in rhythmic patterns while wearing bells on your shingles. He kept goats, he made yogurt, he built furniture with his hands. He composted before composting was a lifestyle choice. He was, in short, a man who looked absolutely nothing like what he was, which was the chief chemist of the CIA's technical services staff and the principal architect of the most extensive covert human experimentation program the American government has ever run. You are watching him at his desk now. He is compact, focused, neatly dressed. He has a slight limp from the clubfoot that gives him a particular rolling gait that people who knew him remembered for the rest of their lives. He is reading a report about LSD. He is, based on available evidence, extremely interested in what he's reading. LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, had been synthesized by the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Laboratories in 1943. And Hofmann had discovered its psychedelic properties that same year in the most accidental way possible, which was by absorbing a small amount through his fingertips and then, famously, riding home on a bicycle during what history now records as the world's first acid trip. Hofmann's lab notes from that afternoon describe the experience as an uninterrupted stream of fantastic pictures and extraordinary shapes with intense, kaleidoscopic play of colors, which is the way a Swiss chemist describes having his entire reality reordered, and which also suggests that the Swiss are perhaps more resilient than they appear. The CIA did not care about Hofmann's bicycle. What the CIA cared about was this. LSD appeared to produce profound alterations in human consciousness. It made people see and hear things that were not there. It dissolved the normal cognitive barriers that humans use to maintain their sense of self and their ability to maintain a coherent narrative about reality. It was, in the language of the program documents, a potential tool. Gottlieb had found his molecule. He had Sandoz's entire supply purchased 22 pounds of it, enough for approximately 100 million doses, and shipped to the United States. He had, as he would later describe in the oblique bureaucratic language these documents always used, a number of ideas about what to do with it. He was a goat farmer. He was a folk dancer. He was a man who made his own cheese. He was also, without apparent contradiction in his own mind, a man who was about to authorize the administration of powerful psychedelic drugs to people who had no idea they were being dosed. The great paradox of Sidney Gottlieb, and there are several to choose from, is that he appears to have genuinely believed he was doing good. The Soviet threat was real. The fear was real. The desire to protect American democracy was real, and he was not, by most accounts, a sadist. He was a true believer. He was also, in practical terms, the man responsible for what was about to happen to a number of people who never had a say in the matter. And that is the part that history does not let go of so easily. In the end, good intentions and terrible consequences have a long and extremely well-documented relationship. Let's talk about how MKUltra actually worked, because the organizational chart of this program is, in its own way, one of the strangest documents the Cold War produced. MKUltra was not a single experiment. It was an umbrella. Beneath it, and this is the part that tends to land like a small depth charge when people first encounter it, there were 150 subprojects. 150, running simultaneously across the United States and Canada, funded through the CIA's Special Projects Division and laundered through a series of front organizations with names like the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology and the Geschichte Fund for Medical Research, which sounds like something a slightly menacing professor might have endowed, and which was, in fact, exactly that. You are looking at the organizational chart now, and it looks less like a government program and more like a particularly ambitious graduate student's fever dream. There are subprojects on hypnosis. There are subprojects on sensory deprivation. There are subprojects on electroconvulsive therapy. There are subprojects on the administration of LSD, mescaline, scopolamine, heroin, amphetamines, and several other substances in combinations that the researchers were, at the time, essentially making up as they went along. There are subprojects on sleep deprivation. There are subprojects on the use of radiation. There are subprojects on psychosurgery. There is, memorably, a subproject on finding out what happens when you give a very large dose of LSD to a cat. Spoiler, nothing useful happened. The cat survived, which is perhaps the most dignified outcome the program produced. The front organizations were crucial to the whole operation, and they are also, in retrospect, something of a masterpiece of institutional cynicism. The CIA couldn't simply walk into Harvard and say, "We would like to fund experiments on human subjects using controlled substances in order to develop interrogation techniques." Or rather, they could. And some evidence suggests they more or less did. But the official approach involved creating foundations with reassuring academic names that then distributed grants to universities, hospitals, and research institutes across North America. The researchers receiving the grants knew, to varying degrees, where the money actually came from. Some of them knew everything and were active participants. Some of them knew enough to ask no questions. Some of them appear to have been genuinely unaware that they were working for the CIA. This last group are, statistically, probably the ones who slept best. The subjects, it should be noted, knew nothing. The subjects were patients in psychiatric hospitals who had consented to treatment, not experimentation. They were prisoners who had been offered modest incentives, cigarettes, reduced sentences to participate in studies they were told were routine. They were volunteers who had responded to advertisements for paid medical research. They were, in some cases, employees of the government itself who were dosed without their knowledge by their own colleagues. The formal term for this practice in the program's internal documents was non-volunteer testing. That is the government's way of saying what you think it means. The organizational genius of MKUltra, if one chooses to use the word genius, and it feels uncomfortable to do so, was its distribution. No single person could see the whole picture. Subproject researchers knew their piece. The front organizations knew their piece. The CIA handlers knew their piece. And by the time you tried to assemble the full picture from the outside, there were enough layers of institutional insulation to make it almost impossible. Almost. Let's be clear about the drug. You are in a Sandoz Laboratories report from 1943, and you are reading Albert Hoffman's field notes, and you are trying to understand what exactly the CIA thought it had found. LSD and the CIA thought they had found a great deal. The early research on LSD was not conducted by the CIA. It was conducted by psychiatrists, many of them in Europe and North America, who believed, with genuine clinical sincerity, that they had discovered a therapeutic tool. LSD appeared to produce a state of altered consciousness that might allow patients to access repressed memories, to break through psychological defenses that years of conventional therapy had failed to penetrate. There were researchers who believed LSD could treat alcoholism. There were researchers who believed it could treat depression. There were researchers who believed that the temporary dissolution of ego it produced might be genuinely therapeutic in the way that knocking down a wall lets you see more of the house. These were not crazy ideas. Some of them have been revisited by contemporary researchers with results that are, depending on whom you ask, quite promising. The clinical history of LSD is considerably more complicated than its cultural history, and the CIA is largely responsible for having flattened that complexity into a single narrative. But the CIA did not read Hoffman's notes and think, therapeutic. The CIA read them and thought, weapon, or tool, or lever. Something you could use on an enemy that would make him unable to maintain his story, unable to protect his secrets, unable to function as the organized human being he'd arrived as. Something that could, in theory, be used to disorient a subject in an interrogation, or to implant suggestions, or to induce confessions, or to erase memories, or, and this was perhaps the most ambitious end of the program's ambitions, to essentially program a person to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. This was the dream, the Manchurian candidate, but real. A subject who could be conditioned through drugs, hypnosis, electroshock, sleep deprivation, or some combination of all of the above to perform an action, including, potentially, a violent action, with no conscious memory of having been told to do it. The word for this, in the program documents, was behavioral modification. You are watching Sidney Gottlieb read these reports at his desk in Langley, and you can see, from the angle of his posture, that he finds the whole thing genuinely compelling. He is a biochemist. He understands what molecules do to brains. He is also a true patriot, in the full, earnest, Eisenhower-era sense of that word, who believes that the United States is in a civilizational contest with the Soviet Union, and that losing that contest is simply not an option. He is not wrong about the contest. He is not wrong about the stakes. He is, however, about to be profoundly wrong about the methods and about who will bear the cost. The LSD was not the only drug in the program's arsenal, but it is the one history remembers, and it is the one Gottlieb found most interesting. He would, over the course of his career, personally supervise its administration to a number of subjects. He would also, on at least one documented occasion, take it himself. He was, by several accounts, someone who found the experience genuinely interesting from a scientific perspective, which may or may not make it better. It probably doesn't make it better. Now, let's talk about the subjects, because this is where the program moves from strange to genuinely difficult to hold. When MKUltra's supporters, and the program did have supporters, within the CIA and within the wider national security apparatus, described the testing program, they used a phrase that appears repeatedly in the declassified documents: operational necessity. The idea was that you couldn't test mind control techniques on volunteers because a volunteer's knowledge that they were in an experiment would contaminate the results. You needed genuine naivety. You needed people who had no idea what was happening to them, so that their reactions would be authentic. This is, scientifically speaking, not an entirely unreasonable position. It is also, ethically speaking, completely insane. The subjects of MKUltra's non-volunteer testing fell into several categories, and you are about to meet a representative sample of them. And I want to be clear before you do that these were real people. They had names, they had families, they had lives that existed before and after what was done to them. They are not cautionary abstractions. They are human beings who were used as instruments by a government that had decided, somewhere in a fluorescent-lit office in Langley, that their ignorance was operationally valuable. The first and largest category was prisoners. MKUltra ran extensive testing programs in federal prisons, most notably the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and the California Medical Facility at Vacaville. The prisoners were offered incentives, usually money, cigarettes, or modest reductions in sentence to participate in research studies that were described to them in the vaguest possible terms. Medical research, a study of human physiology. The men who participated did so voluntarily, in the narrow sense that no one physically restrained them and forced the substances into their bodies. The broader sense of voluntary meaning that you had been fully informed of what was going to happen to you and had consented freely was a concept that the program did not accommodate. You are standing in the corridor of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in 1955, and the man walking toward you is Dr. Harris Isbell, the director of the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, who is a CIA contractor and who has, in his briefcase, a supply of LSD. He is going to administer it to prisoners in doses that exceed what most contemporary researchers would consider remotely safe. He is going to administer it for extended periods. He will, in the most documented case, keep a single subject on LSD continuously for 77 days. 77 days. The word continuous there is doing a great deal of work. The second category was psychiatric patients. This is perhaps the most disturbing subcategory because these were people who had specifically sought help. They had gone to a hospital because they were suffering. They had placed themselves in the care of doctors, and in a number of hospitals, most of them university-affiliated, some of them with excellent reputations, the care they received was not care. It was research, conducted on them, without their knowledge, in the name of a program they had never heard of and would not have been told about even if they'd asked. The third category was, in many ways, the most audacious, the program's own employees and colleagues. There are documented cases of CIA officers and other government employees being dosed with LSD without their knowledge or consent by other CIA officers, at parties, in drinks, in what the program documents describe, with characteristic blandness, as social settings. The program's operators appear to have operated on the theory that you couldn't know how a substance would affect an agent in the field unless you'd seen how it affected someone who was at least familiar with classified environments. This is the logic of a bureaucracy that has stopped thinking about the people it employs and started thinking about them as variables. The fourth category is the most complicated: volunteers who thought they knew what they'd signed up for and didn't. This includes, notoriously, a small number of people who responded to advertisements for human perception studies placed by CIA-affiliated researchers at universities and who showed up expecting something roughly equivalent to wearing headphones and identifying sounds, and got something considerably more than that. In the end, The total number of people directly exposed to MKUltra's non-volunteer testing will never be known, because many of the relevant documents were destroyed. Estimates range from the hundreds into the thousands. We know what we know because of a single filing cabinet that someone forgot to shred. And we know what we know because of Frank Olson. Let's not forget Operation Midnight Climax, because Operation Midnight Climax has a name that sounds like a rejected Bond film title and was, in practice, something significantly weirder than fiction. You are in San Francisco in 1955 in a Telegraph Hill apartment, and you are being watched through a two-way mirror. The man on the other side of the mirror is taking notes. The man whose apartment this appears to be based on the cat on the armchair, the smell of cigarettes, and the half-drunk glass of scotch on the counter is George Hunter White, which is a name so perfectly American it sounds like a character from a novel about the 1950s that no one would believe. George White is, in the order that he himself would probably have given, a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, a CIA contractor, a heavy drinker, and a man who takes his work very seriously. He has a cat named Peaches. Peaches is an orange tabby of magnificent self-possession who is entirely unbothered by the surveillance equipment, the rotating cast of women who arrive through the front door, or the occasional presence of strange men with government credentials who sit in the kitchen and take notes on clipboards. Peaches has her own views on the work being done here. Those views appear to be irrelevant. She is asleep on the armchair. Operation Midnight Climax was technically a subproject of MKUltra, and its methodology was, even by MKUltra standards, baroque. White rented apartments in San Francisco and New York. The San Francisco operation ran from 1955 to 1965, which is a decade, which bears repeating, and he stocked them with CIA money, two-way mirrors, recording equipment, and hired women. The women would bring men back to the apartments. White or his colleagues would dose the men's drinks with LSD. Then White would watch from behind the mirror and take notes. The stated purpose of this operation was to study the behavior of people under the influence of LSD in real-world conditions, specifically conditions involving alcohol, company, and the kind of relaxed guard that comes from thinking you're in a private situation. The operational theory was that an intelligence service might want to use LSD in interrogations or covert operations, and that you couldn't understand how it would work in those contexts without testing it in those contexts. White wrote about his work with, it must be said, a certain enthusiasm. He described the operation in his private correspondence as a great deal of fun, which is one of the more alarming sentences in the declassified MKUltra archive. He also, in later years, wrote a letter that is probably the most candid thing any MKUltra operator ever committed to paper. I toiled wholeheartedly in the vineyards because it was fun, fun, fun. Where else could a red-blooded American boy lie, kill, cheat, steal, rape, and pillage with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest? That letter was sent after his retirement. It is, in a manner of speaking, his memoir. Peaches, who was there for all of it, has left no equivalent document. She was, in any case, a cat, and cats do not write memoirs. She was simply there, on the armchair, being orange, being warm, being entirely indifferent to the moral complexity of her situation. In this respect, she is perhaps the most enviable figure in the entire MKUltra program. The men who were dosed in the Midnight Climax safe houses never knew it happened. They walked out of those apartments and into the rest of their lives, carrying an experience they had no framework for and no knowledge of. Some of them perhaps had strange, fragmentary memories of an evening that didn't quite make sense. Some of them may have assumed they'd had too much to drink. All of them were denied the basic human dignity of knowing what had been done to them. George White retired from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1966. He received commendations. Peaches, presumably, lived out her days in peaceful ignorance of the historical significance of the armchair. Let's talk about what it was like to actually work inside MKUltra on a daily basis, because the operational texture of this program is one of the parts that tends to get lost in the broader horror, and there's something worth noting about how ordinary it looked from the inside. You are in a university laboratory in the mid-1950s, and the man at the bench is a researcher you will call Dr. Harold, because many of the researchers whose participation has been documented preferred, understandably, not to have their full names attached to the historical record. Dr. Harold has a doctorate from a prestigious institution. He has a faculty appointment. He has a parking space with his name on it. His office has a window that faces a pleasant quadrangle where students eat sandwiches on the lawn in spring. He is also a CIA contractor, and he is conducting experiments on his psychiatric patients that he has not told them about, and the reason he has not told them about it when later asked is that he was told not to, and that he had not thought to push back on this instruction very hard, because the instructions came from a foundation that gave his department a great deal of money, and because the Cold War was ongoing, and because everyone around him appeared to have normalized the arrangements, and because the human capacity to rationalize participation in institutional harm is, historically, essentially boundless. This is not an excuse. It is an observation about how these things work. The daily routine of a mid-level MKUltra researcher looked, from the outside, entirely like the daily routine of any other government-funded academic. You arrived at your lab. You drank your coffee. You reviewed your notes from the previous session. You made adjustments to your protocol. You wrote your observations in a document that you then sent via a chain of institutional intermediaries to a foundation office that then sent it to the CIA, which filed it in the Technical Services Staff Archives, where it would eventually be reviewed by Sidney Gottlieb, who was at that moment probably making yogurt in his kitchen in Virginia, or drilling dovetail joints in his woodshop, or possibly dosing a colleague at a CIA holiday party. The research itself varied enormously across subprojects. Some of it was relatively conventional by the standards of the era observational studies, structured interviews, standard dosing protocols. Some of it was not. There were researchers who administered LSD to subjects who were already in psychological distress and noted the results. There were researchers who combined LSD with electroconvulsive therapy. There were researchers who put subjects in sensory deprivation chambers for extended periods and then administered drugs to the disoriented, terrified people inside them. There were researchers who combined drug administration with hypnotic suggestion, attempting to use the altered state of consciousness produced by the drugs as a kind of open door through which post-hypnotic commands could be implanted. Did any of it work? There is a question buried in that question, which is, what would working mean? And the honest answer to the question beneath the question is that the program never produced a reliable, reproducible method of mind control. It never produced a Manchurian candidate. It never produced a genuinely functional truth serum. It never produced a technique for erasing and replacing memories on demand. What it produced was a large body of data about the effects of various substances and techniques on human consciousness, gathered under conditions that would be considered criminal today, and that were, at minimum, deeply ethically compromised at the time. It also produced Frank Olson. Let's talk about hypnosis. Because hypnosis was MKUltra's second great hope, the one that arrived before the LSD and lingered after it, the technique that the program's operators returned to repeatedly because it seemed, on its surface, like exactly the thing they were looking for. The appeal of hypnosis to an intelligence agency is not hard to understand. Hypnosis produces a state of focused, directed suggestibility in which the subject, under the guidance of a skilled practitioner, appears to accept and act on suggestions that they would, in their normal waking state, resist or dismiss. Stage hypnosis had made this visible to popular audiences for generations. The subject clucks like a chicken. The subject forgets their own name. The subject, upon a trigger word, performs an action they agreed to perform while in trance and claims afterward to have no memory of the agreement. This was, if you squinted at it in a certain way, exactly the mechanism the CIA's mind control ambitions required. You are in a university laboratory in 1954, watching a researcher named Dr. Milton, who has a properly authorized CIA contract, and a subject seated in a reclining chair who believes he is participating in a study of relaxation techniques. Dr. Milton has an excellent research pedigree. He is careful, methodical, a note-taker of meticulous habits. He is also, at this moment, attempting to hypnotize this man into a state deep enough that he can be given a post-hypnotic suggestion, a command that the subject will carry out after he leaves the session, triggered by a specific word or gesture, with no conscious memory of having been instructed. The theoretical application: an operative could be hypnotically programmed to carry out an action, deliver a message, open a door, retrieve a document, and then, upon completion, have all memory of the instruction and the action suppressed. The perfect covert operative, from a counterintelligence perspective, is one who cannot be broken under interrogation because they genuinely don't know they've done anything. If they can't remember it, they can't reveal it. This was the dream. It was also, it turned out, a dream with some significant structural problems. The first problem was reliability. Hypnotic susceptibility varies enormously between individuals. Approximately 10 to 15% of the population is highly hypnotizable, genuinely capable of achieving the deep trance states that produce the dramatic suggestibility seen in stage shows. The majority of people are moderately hypnotizable at best. A small but significant minority essentially cannot be hypnotized at all. An intelligence technique that works on 10 to 15% of your subjects and not at all on another 20% is not, from an operational standpoint, a technique you can build a program around. The second problem was the post-hypnotic suggestion itself. Responsible researchers, and there were some, even inside MKUltra's contractor network, who maintained genuine scientific standards, had found that post-hypnotic suggestions tended to be highly susceptible to what they called reality testing. When a hypnotized subject is given a command that, when they emerge from the trance, conflicts with their deeply held values or feels genuinely wrong to them, the post-hypnotic suggestion tends to dissolve on contact with the conflict. You can, apparently, use hypnosis to make a subject cluck like a chicken, because clucking like a chicken doesn't conflict with anything the subject cares about. You cannot reliably use it to make a subject commit an action they would normally refuse, because the refusal is rooted in something deeper than the trance can reach. This was genuinely not what the program wanted to hear. The third problem was amnesia. True post-hypnotic amnesia, the kind where the subject genuinely cannot remember the instruction or the action, is considerably rarer and harder to produce than its popular reputation suggests. The subject often has a vague, diffuse sense that something happened that they are not fully remembering, which is, if anything, worse than full recall from an operational standpoint. A subject who walks around with the nagging feeling that there is a gap in their experience is a subject who might, eventually, talk to someone about it. None of these findings stopped the research. They produced more research, more subprojects, more contractors, more subjects in reclining chairs in university laboratories, believing they were participating in studies of relaxation techniques. The program continued to explore hypnosis as a supplementary technique throughout its operational life, and while it never produced the reliable behavioral programming capability it was seeking, it produced a great deal of documentation about the limits of that capability, which is the kind of contribution to scientific knowledge that is significantly less satisfying when you factor in the cost at which it was produced. There were also, it must be said, researchers in the program who combined hypnosis with the drug protocols, who administered LSD or barbiturates to subjects, and then applied hypnotic suggestion to the disoriented, chemically altered consciousness that resulted. The theory here was that the drug-produced dissolution of normal cognitive defenses might create a kind of opening through which hypnotic suggestion could penetrate more deeply than it could in a normal waking state. The results were, and please understand that this is the word that appears most frequently in the declassified documents about this line of research, variable. Variable. The professional euphemism for, we caused a great deal of suffering and did not learn what we hoped to learn. Dr. Milton continued his research. The subject in the reclining chair eventually went home. And somewhere in a filing cabinet in Langley, the session notes were filed, and the invoices against the front organization account were processed, and the program moved on to the next experiment. Because the next experiment was always just around the corner, and somewhere in there, surely, was the answer they were looking for. Spoiler, there wasn't. Let's talk about Frank Olson, because Frank Olson is the human being at the center of this story, the person whose name you cannot read without feeling the particular sadness that comes from knowing how things end before you've heard how they began. Frank Olson was, in the fall of 1953, a scientist. He had a PhD in bacteriology. He worked for the Army's Special Operations Division at Fort Detrick, Maryland, which was the government's primary facility for biological warfare research, and which was one of the agencies with which MKUltra had what the documents described as a close operational relationship. He was, by all accounts that have survived, a good man, thoughtful, funny, devoted to his family, skilled at his work. He had a wife named Alice and 3 children. He coached Little League. He made his children laugh. He also knew things. He knew things about what the government was doing in the name of national security that occasionally bothered him in ways he found difficult to articulate to people who didn't share his security clearance. He had, in the years just before 1953, been present at, and perhaps peripherally involved, in certain field operations that he was not entirely at peace with. There are accounts from Alice and from colleagues suggesting that in the weeks before November 1953, Frank Olson had been unsettled, withdrawn. Not himself. You are at a retreat in Deep Creek Lake, Maryland, in November 1953. The setting is a CIA-run gathering of scientists and intelligence officers, held in a cabin beside the lake, the kind of American nowhere that looks beautiful and feels slightly eerie if you're paying attention. The trees have mostly lost their leaves. The lake is very still. There is a fireplace. Sid Gottlieb is there. Frank Olson is there. Several other scientists and agency personnel are there. They are eating dinner, and after dinner, Gottlieb adds something to the Cointreau that is being passed around. The something is LSD. He waits 20 minutes before telling anyone. The reasoning, per the program logic, you couldn't study the effects of the drug on informed subjects. The naivety was necessary. The disruption to a subject's reality was the point. Frank Olson, who has unknowingly consumed a significant dose of a powerful psychedelic, has what is described in the records as a bad reaction. He becomes, in the days that follow, increasingly agitated. He tells his wife he has made a terrible mistake. He tells colleagues he wants to leave his job. He is not sleeping. He is not eating. He is not himself in a way that is starting to alarm the people around him. The CIA, to their credit, takes this seriously. They arrange for Olson to be seen by a physician who is CIA cleared, a psychiatrist named Harold Abramson, who is also an MKUltra contractor, which is not ideal from any standard medical ethics standpoint. Abramson's prescribed treatment plan includes, according to some accounts, additional LSD, which is the kind of detail that makes you set down your drink and just sit with it for a moment. Gottlieb also arranges for Olson to be taken to New York City, ostensibly to see a more specialized psychiatrist. He is accompanied by a CIA officer named Robert Lashbrook. They stay at the Hotel Statler on 7th Avenue, room 1018A. On the morning of the 28th of November 1953, Frank Olson fell from the window of that hotel room. He was 43 years old. He died in the street. Robert Lashbrook was in the room when it happened. The official determination at the time was suicide. Frank Olson's family was told that he had thrown himself through the window. They were not told about the LSD. They were not told about the retreat at Deep Creek Lake. They were not told what their husband and father had actually been involved in. They were given a death that was explained to them as the tragedy of a man who had cracked under the pressure of his work without any of the context that would allow them to understand whose work had done the cracking. Alice Olson would not know the full story for more than 2 decades. Her son, Eric, would spend the rest of his life pursuing it. Let's be clear about what we know and what we don't, because Frank Olson's death is one of those historical events that resists the narrative tidiness that would make it easier to absorb. You are standing in room 1018A of the Hotel Statler, and you are looking at the window, and you are trying to hold 2 things in your mind at once. The first thing is this: Frank Olson may have been so profoundly destabilized by what was done to him, the non-consensual drugging, the subsequent psychological deterioration, the sense of terrible knowledge he was carrying about programs and operations that had caused real harm, that he may have been in a state of acute psychological crisis when he fell. The second thing is this: Frank Olson knew things that the CIA did not want known. He had been present at field operations that were not going to look good if they became public. He had been talking to colleagues in ways that suggested he was considering going outside the program to discuss what he knew. He was, from the perspective of the men who ran MKUltra, a potential liability. These 2 things are not mutually exclusive. A man can be both in crisis and in danger. He can be both a legitimate suicide risk and a target for elimination. The window is not an either-or proposition. But what the window is not, given everything we now know, is a simple tragedy of an overworked government scientist. Robert Lashbrook, who was the last person in the room with Frank Olson, telephoned Sidney Gottlieb after Olson fell. He did not call for an ambulance. He called Gottlieb first. The ambulance was called afterward. Gottlieb's phone was the first call. Lashbrook's explanation for this order of operations was that he was in shock and did not know what to do. That is possible. That is a thing that could be true about a human being. The Olson family did not think it was the whole story. In 1994, when the Clinton administration's disclosure of Cold War medical experiments prompted a partial reopening of the case, Frank Olson's body was exhumed and re-examined. The forensic pathologist who conducted the examination, Dr. James Starrs, found evidence that was inconsistent with the official story of Olson having simply leaped through a window. There was a wound on Olson's forehead that was not consistent with impact from the window frame. The evidence suggested to Starrs that Olson had been rendered unconscious before going through the window. The case was never prosecuted. The statute of limitations had long since passed. The CIA acknowledged in 1975 what had been done to Olson at Deep Creek Lake. They paid his family a settlement of $750,000 and issued an apology, which was delivered by William Colby, the CIA director at the time, who was by most accounts genuinely uncomfortable with what he'd inherited. Gerald Ford personally apologized to the Olson family in the Oval Office. The apology was for the LSD. The apology did not address what happened at the window. Frank Olson's son, Eric, is still alive. As this is written, he has never stopped asking what happened in room 1018A. Let's talk about the Canadian connection, because MKUltra did not stop at the American border, and the most extreme iteration of the program's ambitions happened not in a CIA safe house in San Francisco, but in a hospital in Montreal. You are at the Allen Memorial Institute, which is housed in a gray stone Victorian mansion on the slope of Mount Royal in Montreal, Quebec. The building was once a private home. It is now a psychiatric hospital affiliated with McGill University. It is also, in the 1950s and 1960s, the laboratory of Dr. Ewan Cameron. Ewan Cameron is the president of both the American Psychiatric Association and the Canadian Psychiatric Association, which tells you something about where he stood professionally. He is also, in private, a man with a theory that is best described as audacious, and in retrospect is better described as monstrous, though Cameron himself, and this is the part that keeps the story from being simple, appears to have believed in it absolutely. His theory was called psychic driving, and its premise was this: that the human personality, if sufficiently damaged through drugs, electroconvulsive therapy, and extended sleep, could be essentially erased and rebuilt from scratch. Cameron believed that certain psychiatric conditions, particularly schizophrenia, were the result of learned patterns of behavior so deeply embedded that normal therapy could not dislodge them. His proposed solution was to not dislodge them but to demolish them entirely, to destroy the existing personality, and then, in the cleared space that remained, to inscribe new, healthier patterns of behavior through repetitive audio messages played to the nearly unconscious patient. This was the theory. The practice was what happens when a doctor with exceptional institutional authority and very little external oversight is also in possession of a CIA grant and a belief in his own genius. Cameron's patients were, in many cases, not schizophrenic. They were people who had come to the Allen Memorial Institute with relatively moderate problems, anxiety, mild depression, relationship difficulties. They were told they would receive treatment. What they received was a course of depatterning that began with barbiturate-induced sleep lasting days or weeks, progressed to electroconvulsive therapy, administered at voltages and frequencies that exceeded any then accepted therapeutic norm by a factor of between 3 and 30, and concluded with what Cameron called psychic driving, the playing of recorded messages through headphones to deeply sedated patients, sometimes for 16 hours a day. The messages were things like, "You are a good mother and wife," or "You do not hate your father," repeated continuously for weeks. The results were not what Cameron had hoped. The results were, not to put too fine a point on it, catastrophic. Patients emerged from the depatterning process with large gaps in their memories, not just of the treatment, but of their lives. Some could not remember their spouses. Some could not remember their children. Some had to relearn basic life skills. Some never fully recovered. At least one patient was found to have been regressed after treatment to a state of complete incontinence. The CIA's interest in Cameron's work was not in its therapeutic value, which was, to be direct, non-existent. Its interest was in the depatterning itself. If a personality could be erased and rebuilt, that had potential applications. If existing memories could be reliably destroyed, that had potential applications. The CIA funded Cameron's work through front organizations between 1957 and 1960. Cameron died in 1967 on a hiking trip in the Adirondacks, still believing, as far as anyone can tell, that his work had been valuable. The Montreal patients and their families eventually sued the CIA and the Canadian government. Many of them received settlements. None of those settlements undid what had been done. Let's talk about the food. Or rather, because MKUltra doesn't have a food chapter in the traditional sense, let's talk about the chemistry. About what the scientists were putting into human bodies and why. Because the pharmacopoeia of MKUltra is one of the most remarkable lists in the history of experimental science, and it reads like the inventory of a very ambitious chemistry department that has lost its ethical committee. You are standing in a supply room. The shelves are very well organized. Sidney Gottlieb likes organization. There are labels. LSD is on the top shelf, obviously. It is the program's signature compound, the molecule that Gottlieb found most interesting, the one that came first and lasted longest, and generated the most documentation. There are, by conservative estimate, hundreds of human trials involving LSD in the MKUltra archive. There are also, to be clear, trials in which the dosages administered were far in excess of anything a contemporary researcher would consider acceptable, because the program was not interested in therapeutic dosing. It was interested in the outer edge. What happens if you give someone enough? Mescaline is below it, in the amber glass jar that makes it look almost respectable. Mescaline is a naturally occurring psychedelic derived from the peyote cactus, and it had already been studied by European researchers in the early 20th century, some of whom had written about it with the tone of people describing a genuinely profound experience, and others of whom had written about it with the tone of people who would very much like to never do that again. The CIA's interest in mescaline was partly historical. The Germans had apparently experimented with it at Dachau, and partly practical. If LSD was the precision tool, mescaline was the blunt instrument. Scopolamine is further along the shelf. This is the truth serum compound, a substance that has been mythologized in espionage fiction and which the CIA genuinely believed, at least initially, might have properties that would render a subject unable to lie. The belief was not entirely without foundation. Scopolamine is a powerful anticholinergic that produces disorientation, hallucination, and a state in which subjects are often highly suggestible. It also produces nausea, amnesia, and occasionally a deeply unpleasant experience of detachment from reality. It is not, it turned out, a reliable truth serum. What it reliably produces is confusion, which can look like cooperation, but is considerably harder to work with than the fiction suggests. There is also heroin on this shelf, and cocaine, and various amphetamine compounds, and a number of other substances that the program's researchers were testing in combination, because the working theory in several subprojects was that the real key might not be any single substance, but a cocktail, a precise pharmacological combination that could produce, on demand, the specific cognitive state the program was seeking. None of it produced what the program was seeking, not reliably, not reproducibly, not in a way that could be weaponized. What it produced, reliably, was human suffering, and a filing cabinet full of documentation that would, one day, be the most damning archive in American intelligence history, and one filing cabinet that someone forgot to shred. Let's talk about the hospitals, because the clinical setting of MKUltra is, in many ways, its most morally complex theater, not because what happened there was necessarily worse than what happened in the safe houses, but because it happened in the places where people went specifically to get better. You are in a ward. It is clean, in the institutional way that hospitals of that era were clean. Everything that was supposed to be white is white. Everything that was supposed to be in order is in order. The smell is the familiar mixture of disinfectant and something underneath it that isn't quite right. The fluorescent lighting is, as always, doing its best. The patients in this ward are a range of people. Some of them have severe psychiatric conditions. Some of them have conditions that are considerably less severe: anxiety, depression, what a physician of that era might have called nerves. They are here because they were suffering, and they sought help, and this is where help was. They have signed consent forms, most of them. The consent forms consented to treatment. They did not consent to experimentation. The distinction matters enormously. The universities that participated in MKUltra are a list that, when the Senate Intelligence Committee began to compile it in 1975, produced a kind of collective institutional nausea in American academia. Columbia, Harvard, Stanford, Cornell, the University of Illinois, Emory, Johns Hopkins, George Washington. This is not a list of fringe institutions with poor reputations. These are the universities that people use to justify the American research establishment. These are the places whose names, when attached to a study, are supposed to mean something. The faculty members who participated were, in most cases, genuinely distinguished researchers who had convinced themselves or allowed themselves to be convinced that the work they were doing was necessary, that the oversight they were not exercising was someone else's responsibility, that the national security context made the ethical questions different in kind rather than merely different in degree. Some of them appear to have known exactly what they were doing and done it anyway. Some of them didn't ask, which is a different kind of thing, but still a thing. The patients, in the end, are the only people in these wards about whom there is nothing complicated to say. They came because they were hurting. They were used because they were convenient and because they could not object to what they did not know was being done to them. And when they left, some of them months later, some of them fundamentally altered in ways they couldn't explain, and their doctors wouldn't. They went back into lives that the program had touched without their knowledge and without their consent. And they carried that touch with them, invisibly, for the rest of their lives. Some of them knew something had happened to them. The memory gaps were too conspicuous, the changes in themselves too apparent. They just didn't know what it was. Let's talk about the social danger. Because MKUltra existed inside a world where the primary social danger was not the program itself, but the knowledge of it, and where the management of that knowledge was as elaborate and carefully maintained as any of the experimental protocols. The classified world of the early Cold War operated on a principle that the people inside it described as need to know. You were told what you needed to know to do your job, and nothing more. Note: this served a legitimate security function. The more widely information was distributed, the more vulnerable it was to interception or disclosure. But it also served a function that was considerably less legitimate. It made it very difficult for anyone inside the system to see the full picture of what the system was doing, and therefore very difficult for anyone to object to it coherently. The researchers in their university labs knew their subproject. They did not know the other 149. The CIA officers who managed the relationships with those researchers knew a wider slice of the picture. The project directors knew more. Gottlieb and Dulles knew, in principle, everything, though the program was large enough and distributed enough that even they, probably, did not know every detail of every experiment being conducted in their name. This architecture of distributed knowledge was not accidental. It was designed specifically to prevent the kind of internal whistleblowing that a unified picture of the program's activities might have prompted. If you only know your piece, you can tell yourself your piece is fine. If your piece involves administering a drug to psychiatric patients who have consented to treatment but not experimentation, you can tell yourself the drug is being used in a medical context, that the paperwork is in order, that someone above you has made the ethical determinations. You can tell yourself that the system has considered what you haven't considered. You can tell yourself you're just doing science. Frank Olson had seen a larger piece of the picture than most. He had been at Fort Detrick, working in biological warfare research, and he had also been present at certain field operations, the details of which remain partially classified even now, in which biological and chemical agents had been deployed in ways that, from the perspective of the 1950s, were considered acceptable parameters of the Cold War conflict, and which, from the perspective of a thoughtful man who had gone home to his wife and children and tried to sleep, were producing a different kind of verdict. The danger of knowledge in MKUltra's world was that it accumulated. Each piece added context to the next. And there was a point at which the accumulated weight of what you knew became impossible to carry with the equanimity that the institutional culture demanded. Olson had reached that point. He was telling people he had made a terrible mistake. He was not a man who was hiding a secret well. He was a man who was being destroyed by it. This is what made him, in the autumn of 1953, a different kind of problem for the people running the program. Let's talk about what the program actually wanted. Because underneath all the subprojects, and the drug trials, and the safe house operations, and the university grants, there was a central ambition that the program never stopped reaching for. And that ambition is worth examining in some detail, because it is one of the most revealing things about the people who designed it. The program wanted a lever. You understand this intuitively if you think about the Cold War context in which the program was born. The conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union was not, primarily, a military conflict in the 1950s. It was an information conflict, a psychological conflict, a conflict fought in the space between what people believed and what was true. The CIA's job in that conflict was to manage perception, to shape what people knew and thought and felt about the contest they were living inside, to influence through whatever means were available, the decisions that foreign governments and foreign populations made. The lever that MKUltra was reaching for was control of the human mind. Not crude control. The Nazis had tried crude control, and the lesson of that was that crude control produces resistance, resentment, and catastrophic backlash. The kind of control the CIA wanted was subtle. The kind that the subject would not recognize as control. The kind that looked from the inside like the subject's own thoughts, own beliefs, own choices. The fantasy version of MKUltra success would have looked like this. A man is captured, or recruited, or approached. He is given something, a drug, a hypnotic suggestion, a carefully engineered psychological experience. Afterward, he believes things he didn't believe before. He does things he wouldn't otherwise have done. He is, essentially, a different person, a better version, from the CIA's perspective, and he doesn't know it. This fantasy had, at various points, believers in the CIA who were absolutely sincere about its achievability. They were also wrong. LSD does not produce controllable, directable behavioral change. What it produces is disruption, profound, unpredictable, highly individual disruption of normal cognitive functioning. Some people have transcendent experiences. Some people have terrifying experiences. Almost no one has experiences that can be reliably shaped by an external party, because the dissolution of cognitive structure that LSD produces also dissolves the normal channels through which influence operates. You can't implant a suggestion in a mind that is currently experiencing itself as a cloud. Hypnosis, as it turns out, cannot make people do things they are fundamentally opposed to doing. Sensory deprivation produces disorientation, but not reliable suggestibility. Electroshock produces memory loss, but not specific, targeted memory loss. The dream of precise, controllable, reversible behavioral modification remained, throughout the program's history, a dream. What the program produced instead was a body of evidence about the limits of the dream evidence that came at extraordinary cost to the people who were used to produce it. Gottlieb, toward the end of his career, appears to have arrived at something like this conclusion himself. The program ran from 1953 to 1973, and by its final years, it had largely abandoned the more extreme experimental protocols and had shifted toward research that was, relatively speaking, more conventional. Whether this represented a moral evolution or simply a pragmatic acceptance of the evidence is a question the historical record does not answer clearly. Let's talk about the escape fantasy, because even inside MKUltra, people had private reckonings, things they dreamed of, things they told themselves to make the work make sense, things they kept in the rooms of themselves that the institutional culture couldn't quite reach. The subject's escape fantasies are the most legible. They wanted simply to know what had happened to them. They wanted the truth of their own experience. Some of the psychiatric patients who participated in MKUltra experiments without their knowledge spent years afterward in a state of bewildered suffering, trying to understand why their memory had gaps, why certain things felt wrong, why they couldn't account for periods of their lives that the hospital records showed them as having been present for. The fantasy of those people was not dramatic. It was the most basic human desire, to have access to your own story. Several of them eventually got it. The congressional hearings of 1975 and 1977 produced enough documentation that some former subjects were able finally to piece together what had happened to them. The piecing together was not healing, exactly, but it was a kind of justice, the small, minimal justice of knowing. Gottlieb's escape fantasy is harder to read. He left the CIA in 1973, which was, not incidentally, the same year that MKUltra was formally terminated, and the same year that the most devastating journalistic inquiries into the program began to gather momentum. He moved to India for a period, then returned to his farm in Virginia. He volunteered in hospice care. He built furniture. He kept goats. He made yogurt. This is, on one reading, a man running from himself. On another reading, it is a man who genuinely believed he had served his country and was now, in the season of his life that followed, serving humanity in the way most directly available to him. The hospice work, in particular, is hard to reduce to pure cynicism. Hospice volunteers sit with the dying. They provide comfort in the final passages. It is not a performative act. It is very specifically the opposite of glamour. Whether Gottlieb felt guilt real, functional, consequential guilt is something no one who knew him has been willing to say on the record. He gave one interview in the late 1990s in which he described the program as having been a mistake made by people acting in good faith under extraordinary pressure. He used those words in various combinations more than once. He did not use the word sorry. Let's talk about the church committee, because the church committee is the moment when the curtain came down, and it came down in a way that was spectacular, even by the extraordinary standards of what was behind it. You are in the United States Senate in 1975. The year is important. Watergate happened in 1972 and 1973. Nixon resigned in 1974. The country is in a mood, a sustained, concentrated, partisan-crossed mood to find out what else the government has been doing that it wasn't supposed to be doing. There is an appetite for accountability that is, by the standards of any peacetime period in American history, unusual. Senator Frank Church of Idaho is chairing a select committee on intelligence. Its mandate is broad: to investigate the intelligence activities of the United States government and report what it finds. Church is a Democrat, a former Navy officer, a man who believes in democratic oversight of the executive branch with the particular intensity of someone who has watched oversight fail catastrophically. The committee subpoenas documents. It interviews witnesses. It receives from the CIA itself, somewhat to the CIA's own discomfort, a report that CIA Director William Colby has commissioned on the agency's past activities. The report is known internally as the family jewels. It is, in the words of people who read it at the time, the most remarkable document in the history of American intelligence. And the remark is not a compliment. It contains, among other things, documentation of assassination plots, domestic surveillance programs, mail opening operations, and MKUltra. The committee's hearings on MKUltra produced, for the American public, one of those moments that happens occasionally in the history of democracies, when the gap between what the government said it was doing and what it was actually doing becomes fully, publicly visible and cannot be unseen. The testimony was specific. The documentation was damning. The witnesses, including Gottlieb himself, who testified before the committee, were not willing to express what the committee members clearly believed was the appropriate level of remorse. The public reaction was what you might expect: outrage, disbelief, a particular kind of disillusionment that comes specifically from learning that the institutions you trusted were not only doing the thing they said they were against, but doing it to the people they were supposed to be protecting. And then, gradually, as tends to happen, the outrage found its natural level. The church committee produced recommendations. Some of them were implemented. Some of them were, in the years that followed, quietly attenuated. Oversight mechanisms that the committee called for were created, and those mechanisms were, in some cases, better than nothing, and in other cases, barely that. Congress passed legislation. The CIA's charter was reformed. Certain practices were formally prohibited. Whether those prohibitions have held, in all cases, ever since, is a question this script will not attempt to answer, because it is not a sleep script's job to make you lie awake. Let's not forget the people who knew something was wrong before anyone said so officially, because they existed, and their silence and the reasons for it are as much a part of this story as the programs themselves. Inside any large covert operation, there are always people who, at some point, feel the thing that Frank Olson was feeling, the accumulated weight of knowledge, the private reckoning in the dark hours. The moment where the institutional framing, national security, operational necessity, the greater good, stops fitting over the reality the way it used to, and you are left with something that looks, without the framing, like a very different thing. Most of these people said nothing, and this is not because they were cowards necessarily, or morally bankrupt, or indifferent to suffering. It is because the institutional structure they operated inside was specifically, brilliantly designed to prevent them from saying anything. The classification system meant that any disclosure was a federal crime. The compartmentalization meant that the person you might confide in didn't have the clearance to receive the information. The culture of the intelligence community in the 1950s and 1960s was one of absolute institutional loyalty. You were the people who had chosen to carry the weight that the public couldn't carry, to do the things that needed doing in the spaces where the public couldn't look, and the price of that role was that you carried it alone and quietly and for as long as the work required. You are standing in a corridor of Fort Detrick in 1953, and a colleague of Frank Olson's is watching him walk toward his office, and something in the way Olson moves, slightly hunched, slightly too careful, the gait of a man carrying invisible weight on his shoulders, is producing in this colleague a feeling of low, persistent alarm. The colleague knows Olson. He knows something is wrong. He does not know what specifically was done at Deep Creek Lake, because the operations there were compartmentalized even within the Fort Detrick community. He does not have the full picture. He has only a feeling and a friendship, and no sanctioned channel through which to express either. This colleague, probably, said nothing. This is not a specific documented case. It is a composite of what the testimonies and memoirs of people who worked adjacent to MKUltra have produced when read together. But it describes a real phenomenon, the peripheral witness, who sees the edge of something without seeing the whole thing, and who has no mechanism for what they've seen that doesn't involve consequences they are not prepared to face. There were also researchers, documented ones, who raised concerns within their institutional contexts and were managed. A university researcher who expressed discomfort with a protocol was not typically fired or arrested. He was talked to. His concerns were addressed with the language of necessity and context. He was reminded of the larger stakes. He was, in the intelligence community's term of art, handled. And usually the handling worked, because the researcher was not irrational, and the arguments made to him were not without internal logic, and the social and professional costs of continued dissent were real. The ones who could not be handled simply knew less. The compartmentalization was self-reinforcing. The more doubt a researcher expressed, the less operational information they received, which meant they saw a thinner slice of what the program was doing. which made their moral picture look cleaner, which made continued participation feel more defensible. There were genuine dissenters. There were researchers who withdrew from programs when they understood what the programs were. There was a bioethicist named Henry Beecher at Harvard who, in 1966, published a landmark article in the New England Journal of Medicine documenting 22 cases of unethical human medical experimentation, not all of them MKUltra related, but some that prompted enough institutional discomfort to contribute slowly and imperfectly to the eventual reform of research ethics standards in the United States. Beecher's article did not name the programs or the researchers. He anonymized the cases because naming them would have prevented publication and possibly ended his career. He published what he could, in the form he could, and it contributed to a conversation that took another decade to produce meaningful change. This is how change usually works inside institutions. Not with a single, clean, dramatic revelation, but with a series of partial disclosures, each one revealing a little more of the picture, each one moving the conversation slightly further than it was before. It is unsatisfying as a narrative. It is, however, the honest account. The people who knew something was wrong and said small things in the forms available to them at the cost they could sustain, they are part of this story too. Their names are, mostly, not in the record. Their contributions are mostly not legible as heroism in the way the story wants them to be. But they were there, in the corridors and the laboratories and the filing rooms, feeling the weight of what they were adjacent to and doing what they could with the tools they had and the courage they could find. That is, in the end, what most of us do. And sometimes, accumulated across enough people, across enough time, it is the thing that finally tips. Let's not forget Richard Helms, because Richard Helms is the man with the paper shredder, and the paper shredder is, in its own way, the most eloquent statement of institutional self-awareness in the entire MKUltra story. Richard Helms was the director of Central Intelligence from 1966 to 1973, which means he was the director of the CIA when the Church Committee was beginning to form on the horizon and when it was becoming, to anyone paying attention, extremely clear that a congressional investigation into the CIA's past activities was a significant possibility. He was a career intelligence officer, precise, controlled, an absolute professional in the tradecraft sense of the word. He was also a man who understood, with perfect clarity, what the MKUltra documents contained and what they would mean in the hands of a Senate Select Committee. In 1973, shortly before he left the CIA directorship, Helms ordered that the MKUltra files be destroyed. The order was carried out. The files of most MKUltra subprojects, the experimental protocols, the subject files, the dosing records, the outcome reports, the administrative correspondence were shredded. What was contained in those files, in detail and specificity, is now gone. We know MKUltra happened because of the documents that survived. We don't know the full scope of what happened because of the documents that didn't. The shredding is, in a manner of speaking, a confession. You do not destroy 20 years of research files because the research was admirable. You destroy them because you know, with clarity, that the research was not admirable, and because you are calculating that the historical record is more manageable without the details than with them. Helms testified before the Church Committee. He was subsequently convicted of perjury for statements he made before the committee about a separate program, the CIA's involvement in the 1973 coup in Chile. He was fined $2,000 and given a suspended sentence. He did not go to prison. He later described his conviction as a badge of honor and was celebrated at a party by former CIA colleagues. This detail has been reported accurately. Nothing has been added or embellished. The filing cabinet that saved the historical record was in a record storage facility in Warrenton, Virginia. It contained approximately 20,000 MKUltra documents, budget records, financial files, procurement records that had been filed separately from the operational documents and were therefore not included in Helms's shredding order. A researcher named John Marks obtained them through a Freedom of Information Act request in 1977. The documents became the basis for his 1,979 book, The Search for the Manchurian Candidate, which remains one of the most comprehensive accounts of the program. One filing cabinet in a record storage facility in Warrenton, Virginia. History pivots on remarkably small things. Let's talk about the aftermath, because the aftermath of MKUltra is a study in contrasts that would be darkly comic if the material weren't so genuinely heavy. The subjects, many of them never knew. Some of them found out through the congressional hearings and the subsequent media coverage. Some of them sued. Some of them won settlements, modest ones, typically the kind that acknowledge harm without really addressing it. The standard figure was in the range of several $1,000s per person for things like weeks or months spent in a hospital being psychically dismantled by a doctor working for a secret government program. The amounts were not proportional to the harm and were not intended to be. The Canadian subjects Cameron's patients from the Allen Memorial Institute eventually received settlements from the Canadian government, which had funded some of Cameron's work independently. The amounts were somewhat larger. They were also, to be clear, not large enough. Frank Olson's family received $750,000 and an Oval Office apology. They did not receive a full accounting of what had happened. Eric Olson, Frank's son, has spent his life in pursuit of that accounting and remains, as of the time of this writing, without a definitive answer about whether his father jumped or was pushed. The perpetrators, Helms, as noted, was convicted of perjury on an unrelated matter, fined $2,000, and released. He later published a memoir and was celebrated as an intelligence elder statesman. Gottlieb retired, kept his goats, did his folk dancing, worked in hospice care, and gave one interview in which he described the program as a mistake made in good faith under extreme pressure. He died in 1999. His death was, by most accounts, peaceful. Cameron died in 1967, still apparently believing he had been doing useful work. George White, the man who ran the safe houses, who wrote the letter about lying and killing and stealing with the blessing of the all-highest retired from the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and moved to Stinson Beach, California, where he apparently spent his final years with his wife. Peaches, the cat's fate after the closure of the safe houses, is not documented. She was, in all likelihood, fine. Cats generally are. None of the principal architects of MKUltra were prosecuted for the human experimentation itself. Not one. The statute of limitations had passed. The evidence had been shredded. The institutional architecture of classification protected the individuals inside it. And still, in 1975 and 1977, the Senate heard, and the names were named, and the documents, the ones that survived, were read into the public record. And whatever else one says about what happened, it is a matter of public historical fact that it happened, and it is in the record, and it cannot be unlearned. Let's talk about the human connection, the warmth, the things that kept people tethered to themselves inside the coldest institutional structures the program produced. This chapter is more difficult to write than the others because the primary documented human connections in MKUltra's story are the ones that were used as tools or the ones that broke, but they are there. Frank Olson's connection to his family was not, in the end, what the program destroyed. His family remembers him, across the decades, as a father and husband who was present and funny and warm. Alice Olson's account of her husband, given in interviews across many years, is of a man who played catch with his children, who laughed at himself, who worked hard and tried to do right, and was crushed by a weight that was placed on him without his consent. She carried the uncertainty of his death for more than 20 years before any part of the truth emerged. She died before the forensic re-examination. She did not know, finally, what happened at the window. Eric Olson's connection to his father is the organizing principle of his adult life. He was 9 years old when his father died. He has spent more than 70 years, he is in his 80s now, trying to understand what happened in room 1018A and to hold the people responsible for it accountable. He has organized and participated in public exhibitions about his father. He has written and spoken about MKUltra extensively. He has never, publicly, expressed hatred for the people involved. What he expresses, consistently, is a need for the truth, the kind of need that a child develops when they lose a parent and are told a story about that loss that doesn't quite add up. The warmth in this story lives in the places the program couldn't reach. It lives in Frank Olson's letters home, from business trips affectionate, funny, describing the cities he was in with the particular specificity of a man who genuinely found the world interesting. It lives in the accounts of his colleagues at Fort Detrick, who knew him as a good scientist and a better person. It lives in Alice's choice, and then Eric's choice, to keep asking. And it lives, in a smaller but real way, in Peaches the cat, who spent a decade on an armchair in a CIA safe house and was apparently content with the arrangement because Peaches was a cat, and cats do not interrogate their circumstances. She was warm. She was orange. She was there. And in a program built almost entirely on instrumentalization, on the use of people and resources as means toward ends, she was, possibly, the only occupant of any of the program's facilities who was simply, uncomplicatedly alive. Let's talk about what the program reveals, because we're now in the part of the episode where the historian steps back and the voice gets quieter, and we look at the whole thing from a slight distance and try to say something true. MKUltra was not a rogue operation. This is the thing that is hardest to hold. It was not a group of bad actors who infiltrated the CIA and ran a criminal program in secret beneath the knowledge of responsible leadership. It was authorized. It was reviewed. It was funded through official channels, laundered through fake foundations, and approved at the highest levels of the agency's leadership. Alan Dulles Patrician, silver-haired, the man who made the CIA what it was, signed the authorizations. He knew what he was signing. The program was run by people who were, in many respects, the best educated, most credentialed, most accomplished men in their respective fields. Ewan Cameron was not a marginal figure. He was the president of 2 national psychiatric associations. The university researchers who participated held chairs at institutions that set the standard for American science. Gottlieb had a PhD from Caltech. These were not people who had slipped through the system's filters. They were, in many cases, the people who ran the filters. And that is the thing that makes MKUltra not merely a historical aberration, but a genuinely useful object of study. Because what it reveals is something about the way institutions and intelligence and moral reasoning interact that is not specific to the 1950s or to the CIA or to the Cold War. It reveals that institutions can absorb and normalize harm if the harm is distributed widely enough, classified carefully enough, and framed in a sufficiently compelling ideological context. It reveals that the capacity for moral rationalization, for telling yourself that the end justifies the means, that the people being used are acceptable collateral damage, that someone above you has made the ethical determinations so you don't have to, is not a feature of bad people, but a feature of people, including good people, including smart people, including people who love their families and make their own cheese and go folk dancing on weekends. The paradox at the heart of MKUltra is this: a program designed to protect American freedom was executed by Americans who stripped freedom from American citizens. The very thing they were afraid the Soviets were doing to their people they were doing, not by calculation, not by hypocrisy in most cases, but by the accumulated momentum of institutional logic, ideological certainty, and the corrosive effect of secrecy on moral judgment. This is, in the end, not a story about monsters. It is a story about people who became capable of monstrous things because the architecture around them made it possible. And the most important question MKUltra asks is not who did this, but what made it possible, and whether the conditions that made it possible still exist. The uncomfortable answer is that some of them probably do. But you are here, and the night is quiet, and that question is not for this moment. That question is for daylight. This moment is for something softer. Let's step back and just hold this for a moment, because you have traveled far tonight, and not to anywhere comfortable, and you have kept company with some difficult material. And the last thing this chapter wants to do is dismiss that. It wants to honor it. The people who were subjected to MKUltra, the prisoners and the patients, and the unknowing civilian participants, and the government employees dosed at their own Christmas parties, were, in the context of their time, invisible. The architecture of classification made them invisible. The front organizations made the money invisible. The bureaucratic language made the harm invisible. They were described in program documents as test subjects and non-volunteer participants and subjects of behavioral modification research, which are the ways that institutions drain human beings of their particularity, of their names and faces and lives, in order to make them easier to use. They were not invisible. They were Dorothy and Harold and Marie and a man who went by James in the Atlanta penitentiary and who spent 77 days on LSD without knowing he was on it, and who never fully told anyone what that was like, not because he couldn't, but because there weren't words that fit. They were the patients at the Allen Memorial Institute who lost weeks and months of their lives and came home altered and couldn't explain the alteration to their families. They were the men who walked out of apartments in San Francisco with strange memories of evenings that didn't make sense. They survived, most of them, some of them. And they were, regardless of what was done to them, fully, completely, unreducibly human, which is the one thing the program was never quite able to strip away, no matter how hard it tried. Let's talk about what you have right now, as you lie here, that none of them did. You have informed consent. This is not a small thing. The doctrine of informed consent, the principle that before a medical or experimental procedure is performed on you, you must be told what it is, what it involves, what the risks are, and you must freely agree to it, did not exist in any legally enforceable form in the United States at the time MKUltra began. The Nuremberg Code, which established informed consent as a foundational principle of medical ethics following the Nazi doctors' trials, had been published in 1947. The CIA began its human experimentation program in 1953. The Nuremberg Code was not a binding legal instrument. It was a statement of principle. It was a statement of principle that the CIA's contractors read and, in many cases, set aside. You have legal recourse. You can sue. You can complain to a regulatory body. You can call a journalist. You can tell someone in authority what is being done to you, and that person is, in most circumstances, legally obligated to take it seriously. The people who were subjected to MKUltra's experiments had none of these options, because the program was classified, because the people in authority were the people running the program, and because the institutional culture that surrounded the whole apparatus was specifically designed to prevent the emergence of a coherent complaint. You have your bed, you have clean sheets, you have a mattress that, whatever its other qualities, has not been designed to destabilize your sense of reality. You have the fan in the corner making white noise, which is a thing you chose to turn on, in a room you chose to sleep in a life that is, at this moment, your own. That is not nothing. In fact, right now, at the end of one of the stranger stories the 20th century produced, your bed is more than not nothing. It is something extraordinary. So here you are, still breathing, still warm. You've spent tonight inside a world of government offices and fluorescent lights and filing cabinets and laboratory corridors and a safe house in San Francisco where a cat named Peaches sat on an armchair and observed everything with magnificent, unimpressed tranquility. You've been there for the signing of the authorizations and the shredding of the documents and the quiet, devastating aftermath of a program that tried to reach inside the human mind and rearrange it, and found, as most programs of that ambition, find that the human mind is significantly more resilient and significantly more mysterious than the men who designed the program had anticipated. You've been in room 1018A, in a manner of speaking, and you've stood in the hospital wards, and you've sat at the desk where Sidney Gottlieb rolled up his sleeves, and you've read the letter that George White wrote about his vineyards. You've watched the filing cabinet in Warrenton, Virginia, not get shredded. You've watched the church committee take its testimony. You've watched the settlements get paid. It has been, in a manner of speaking, a very full night. Now let's take a moment for the people who lived inside this history, not as protagonists or architects or cautionary figures, but as human beings. Frank Olson, who coached Little League and wrote letters home and died carrying a weight he couldn't put down. Alice Olson, who waited more than 20 years for a partial truth that was still not the whole truth. Eric Olson, who has kept asking, decade after decade, with a persistence that is a form of love. The man in the Atlanta penitentiary who endured 77 days of something he could never quite explain. The patients at the Allen Memorial Institute who came home with pieces of themselves missing. The men who walked out of apartments in San Francisco and couldn't account for the evening. They were all doing their best with the circumstances they had been handed. They were, in almost every case, more resilient than the circumstances deserved. And the fact that their names are now part of the record, that their experiences are documented, even imperfectly, even incompletely, matters. It matters because the alternative is that they remain invisible, which is what the program wanted them to be. Now, here is the contrast that I ask you to hold, gently, in this quiet moment. You are lying in a bed in the present. The sheets are clean. The temperature is whatever you chose it to be, because you control the thermostat, which is a recent and remarkable invention when you consider it. You have access to a glass of water, uncontaminated, from a tap that delivers it without ceremony. You have chosen, of your own free will, to spend tonight listening to a story about history, and when the story is over, you will roll over and close your eyes and sleep. No one will put anything in your drink. No one is watching you through a two-way mirror. No one has a clipboard. The fan is just a fan. It's on your side. The people in this story did not have those things. The people in this story were subjected to one of the most sustained programs of institutional harm in American domestic history, and most of them never knew it was happening. And most of the people who did it to them faced no meaningful consequence. That is the weight of it. That is the thing worth carrying into the morning. But the morning is morning, and this is night. And the thing history asks of you, the honest, achievable thing, is not despair, but awareness. Know this happened. Know that ordinary people with good credentials and patriotic feelings did it. Know that the architecture of institutional secrecy made it possible. And know that the people who suffered it were not abstractions. They were human beings, living their lives as fully as they could manage, which is what people always do. In every century, under every set of circumstances, history places them inside. They were tough and funny and bewildered and loving and resilient and human, all of it at once. That is, in the end, the most consistent thing about people across all of recorded history, and it is the thing that makes history worth knowing. The room is quiet. The fan is running. Your body is warm. The blanket is doing exactly what a blanket is supposed to do, which is to be an uncomplicated comfort in a complicated world. Close your eyes. Let the filing cabinet stay closed for tonight. Let Peaches keep her armchair. Let the fluorescent light flicker its way to darkness. Let Frank Olson's letters home be the last thing the letters, and Alice reading them, and the kids playing in the yard at Fort Detrick, and all the ordinary, unremarkable, completely irreplaceable days that came before November 1953, and that no government program can reach back and take. You are safe. You are warm. You are in a room of your own choosing, in a life of your own making, and the history is behind you now, and it will be there in the morning to look at clearly. For tonight, let it rest. Sleep well,